Good morning and welcome to Farm Science Review. My name is Ann Chanon. I'm the Ag and Natural Resources Educator for Lorain County. And today we're going to talk about how to use compost and cover crops to improve your soils. My talk this morning is based on research from a number of universities, including Penn State, the University of Missouri, the University of Maryland, Illinois, Iowa State, and Purdue. What I hope you take from this program is a better understanding of the benefits of both cover cropping and composting, in terms of cover crops, attributes of the various cover crops, how to plant and then how to manage them. With composting, how to build a compost pile, how to recognize if you happen to have a problem with the compost pile, and how to solve it. Let's look briefly at the composition of soil. In an ideal soil, we would find 45% solid particles or mineral matter, 5% organic matter, 25% of the volume would be air spaces, and 25% would be for soil water. This would be ideal for supporting any plant life. The mineral matter is going to come from weathered rock. The 5% of organic matter is going to be the result of decayed and living plant matter, as well as both macro and microorganisms. However, often in our urban and suburban environments, we find denser, tighter, compacted soils with few air pockets. Water infiltration is poor, and very often we have organic matter levels of less than 1% of that soil volume. Clay soils are particularly problematic if we're trying to grow a garden because they're heavy. They don't allow that water to drain through easily. This is a problem since many of our common garden plants and many of our ornamentals require good, well-drained soil for the best growth. Clay can be gooey and heavy when it's wet and hard as brick when it's dry. The key to working with a clay soil is to add organic matter to it. The organic matter will improve that soil structure and as a result improve water infiltration and drainage. The same thing is true if we have a very sandy soil. Sandy soils are also very, very low in their capacity to hold on to ions. This is improved with the addition of organic matter. It also will help hold on to water, which is a problem since sandy soils can very often be quite dry. Soil properties can be divided into three categories: physical, biological, and chemical. And organic matter has a role in improving all three aspects of soil. While nothing will change soil texture, that's the amount of sand, silt, and clay we find in a soil, organic matter can improve the soil structure by holding particles together, stabilizing, helping for the formation and stabilization of aggregates, and in turn that improves porosity and reduces soil density. In a sandy soil, organic matter increases the water holding capacity and again aids in the formation of those stable aggregates. Organic matter serves as a food source for both the macro and microorganisms. We're going to talk more about that in an upcoming slide. And in terms of soil chemistry, particularly in a sandy soil, organic matter increases the cation exchange capacity and serves as a slow-release reservoir of nutrients for plant growth. So what are the components of organic matter? Of the total volume, 10% is fresh residue. So these are materials that have not yet begun the decomposition process. About a third to maybe up to half are materials in active decomposition in some state of decomposition. And then we have another third to almost half which are going to be stabilized. These are organic materials that have broken down and their decomposition is complete. And all of this is accomplished by the living organisms, which actually make up less than 5% of the total fraction of organic matter. So what are some of the benefits of organic matter? Organic matter can supply nutrients to plants on a slow release basis, thus helping to reduce the need for inorganic fertilizers. They promote earthworms and other living organisms that help improve soil structure. We also see that organic matter reduces soil compaction and soil crusting, and it improves water infiltration and improves drainage for clay soils and water retention in sandy soils. So how can we increase the amount of organic matter in our soils? One effective way to increase organic matter is by cover cropping. This is a practice that's been used in agricultural production, especially by specialty crop growers, but it is a practice that can benefit the home gardener. The terms cover crop and green manure are sometimes used interchangeably, but this is not absolutely correct. A green manure crop is similar to a cover crop, except that it's always turned under while it's still green, and this might not be the case for a cover crop. Cover crops are planted between growing seasons to improve soil health, so they're not harvested as a crop themselves. Cover crops have a host of benefits, but there isn't one single species that does it all. So you need to actually think about and determine your priorities and your goals, and then select a cover crop species that will help you meet them. So what are some of these goals? To help break up a compacted soil, just a general increase in organic matter, to prevent erosion, to prevent nutrient runoff, to attract beneficial insects, to fix nitrogen and suppress weeds. Cover crops form a living mulch in the garden, and because they grow thickly among each other, they can help reduce soil splash and erosion. They can keep weeds in check, and they do this both through light exclusion, since many weed seeds need light to germinate, and in the case of rye, it's been shown to have allelopathic properties. That's actually chemical suppression of weed germination. What I'm sharing with you today is just a partial list of the most common cover crops. Based on your goals, you can choose to plant a single species or a mixture of species. Within each group, so the legume group and the non-legume group, there are both warm and cool season cover crop species to choose from. A valued non-legume cover crop are the brassicas. The brassicas include not only tillage radish, but also turnips and mustards. These species actually contain a natural chemical called a glycosinolate that's produced in their roots. There have been studies showing promise that these compounds can actually help to manage some soil-borne pathogens, including nematodes, and this research is still ongoing. The main advantage of a legume cover crop is its ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into a form that plants can use. This is done through a symbiotic relationship with a rhizobacteria. In fact, it is a good idea to actually inoculate your legume seeds prior to planting with this beneficial organism. This will help to increase the amount of nitrogen that is fixed per root nodule. This fixed nitrogen is then available to the soil after the legume plant begins to break down. This fixed nitrogen allows the garden to rely less on synthetic fertilizers, and although a cover crop will never supply all of the nitrogen that is needed the following season, it does help to make the garden more sustainable. The most common cool season legume crops are winter peas, crimson clover, and hairy vetch. The major benefit of non-legume grass cover crops is biomass. These crops have fibrous root systems that reduce soil loss, and they uptake nutrients that might otherwise be leached from the soil over the winter. Plus, for their energetic growth, they help to suppress weeds. Some of the most common non-legume cover crops are buckwheat and sorghum Sudan grass hybrids for the warm season, and oats, winter wheat, and winter rye for the cool season. And while both legume and non-legume cover crops contribute organic matter to the soil, the grass cover crops actually produce more organic matter per unit of area. It is generally considered to be a good practice to mix at least one grass and one legume species, and to have one of them survive over the winter to protect the soil. Let's take a closer look at some of these cool season cover crops. Beginning with tillage radish, also known as daikon radish or Japanese radish. And as you can see here, they have a very large taproot, 12 to 18 inches in length. There's a close cousin of the tillage radish called the oilseed radish. Its taproot is stubbier and more branched, but it tends to be more cold tolerant than the tillage radish. Both of these plants are members of the mustard family, that's Brassicaceae, and both are excellent at breaking up compacted soils, earning them the nickname biodrills. Tillage radishes grow rapidly in the fall and with high biomass production, making them excellent as nutrient scavengers and competitive with other plants. Tillage radishes should be planted in late summer to allow them enough time prior to a hard freeze to develop those taproots. The radishes themselves are not harvested, but die in the field over the winter and begin to decay and contribute nitrogen stored back to the plants in the spring. The dying off in winter, the radishes actually leave root channels in the soil. This allows the soil to dry and warm faster in spring and creates vertical holes in zones of weakness that help break up the soil surface. Winter peas, also known as black peas or field peas, rank highest in terms of their nitrogen fixation with the assistance of rhizobium bacteria. The above ground portion of this plant is a vine, typically 2 to 4 foot in length, and is slender and succulent. This species can be planted either as a standalone crop, but is typically mixed either with winter wheat or with oats. This is a plant that will be winter killed if it is exposed to sub-zero temperatures for an extended period of time without snowfall. And while this plant does produce a large amount of biomass, that biomass actually breaks down rapidly, so it does not contribute to the long-term organic matter and does not make a good organic mulch for weed control. It is excellent in providing an organic source of nitrogen for the following crop. Our next legume is crimson clover. Crimson clover is gaining popularity as a cool season legume. It is planted in late summer and provides good ground cover as well as good weed control, as it fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere as well as scavenges nitrogen from the soil. In a field trial of 6 different annual legumes, including hairy vetch and winter peas, crimson clover was found to produce the most dry matter. Crimson clover grows well in mixtures with grasses such as oats and winter rye, and is recommended for erosion control because of its high early autumn dry mass production. It is only marginally hardy and would typically be killed in zones 5 and colder. If it is allowed to survive the winter and allowed to bloom, it is a beneficial source of nectar, but management is important. If the clover is not killed over the winter, you will need to terminate it in spring, as it will recede and could become a problematic weed. Hairy vetch is one of our most adaptable legumes. It can be planted either in spring and summer as an annual crop, or it can be planted in fall. It is hardy to zone 4. It is a top nitrogen provider and can help you replace some or most of the nitrogen fertilizer needs for the following season's crop. If planted in fall, vetch needs to be planted 30 to 45 days before killing frost in order to allow enough time for the plants to establish. The roots will continue to develop over the winter and growth will resume in spring. Vetch can become a sprawling vine up to 12 foot in length. Its abundant and viney biomass can be both a benefit in helping to control erosion and smothering spring weeds, but termination of the plant is important prior to planting. Soil moisture was found to be higher under vetch and vetch rye mixtures than under rye alone or with no cover crop. Vetch improves topsoil tilth and creates a loose and friable soil structure. Vetch does not contribute to the long-term buildup of organic matter, however, due to its tendency to break down completely. Vetch does have one management challenge in that about 10 to 20% of vetch seeds are considered hard, and that means that they lay ungerminated in the soil for 1 or more seasons, and this can be a weed problem. Oats are an excellent grass cover crop, especially if you're planting an early spring vegetable garden. Oats are relatively inexpensive and they're reliable. They winter kill in hardiness zones 6 and colder, which is most of Ohio. They provide quick weed suppression, they uptake excess soil nutrients, and improve the productivity of legumes such as winter peas and clover when planted as mixtures. Their fibrous root system also holds onto soil during adverse weather conditions. Oats thrive under cool, moist conditions and on well-drained soils, but fare poorly under hot and dry weather. Oats germinate quickly and are great for smothering weeds as they outcompete them. Oats do need to be planted 6 to 10 weeks before a killing freeze, but when soil moisture is adequate. Winter rye is the most commonly used cover crop species, and it is different from annual ryegrass. This is the grain of rye flour and is known as cereal rye or grain rye. Winter rye is an excellent winter cover crop because it rapidly produces ground cover that holds soil in place against the forces of erosion. Rye's deep root system helps to prevent soil compaction in annually tilled soils and is great for breaking up tight clays. Compared to other grains, rye grows faster in the fall and produces more dry matter. And rye is the most winter hardy of all of the cereal grains, tolerating temperatures as low as -30 once it is established, and can even germinate in temperatures as low as 35 degrees. Winter rye has a wide planting window. It can be sown early, and those plants become larger and are better scavengers of nitrogen, or it can be sown late after the first frost. When sown late, higher seeding rates should be used because the individual plants will remain smaller. In spring, rye will resume growth early, and it can produce a very extensive and tough root system, making it difficult to break up with tillage. Rye also produces some allelopathic compounds which will inhibit the germination of small seedlings such as vegetable seedlings like carrots. So it's important to be able to give enough time, at least 3 or 4 weeks, from the time you till in your rye until you plant. So where can cover crops be used? Most frequently, we see cover crops being used in vegetable gardens, raised beds, and in new gardens. The planting rate will depend on the species, and we're going to look at that in just a minute. And how do we deploy this? First, we want to clear the area of any debris in the area to be planted. We want to rake that smooth to create a good seeding bed. And then we want to mix the seed with either compost or soil to aid in broadcasting over the garden. And we want to broadcast it evenly. We then want to rake that into the soil to provide good seed to soil contact and then to water it lightly. Here we see the seeding rates, planting times, and planting depths for tillage radish and the legumes that we've talked about. So we can see that tillage radish and winter peas and crimson clover all need to get an early start. They need to be in the ground 6 to 8 weeks before a hard freeze. Vetch needs about 4 to 6 weeks before a freeze. We can see that these are actually relatively small seeds, so they should not be planted very deeply. Remember, in terms of seeding rate, this 100 square feet is an area 10 by 10, so multiply is needed depending on your area. So here we see the seeding rates for the grass species. So for oats, we can see the planting times range from late July into the beginning of September. And winter rye has that wide range from September into November. So we can see that the seeding rates are a bit higher. These seeds are a bit larger than the legumes that we were just talking about. And if you're going to be planting winter wheat, you can use the same seeding rate as used for winter rye. So in terms of cover crop management in spring for those crops that overwinter, such as hairy vetch, winter wheat, winter rye, it's important to cut the plants down prior to flowering. This will prevent the plants from setting seed and potentially becoming weeds. You need to decide if you're going to leave the debris sit on the soil surface to act as a mulch, or if you're going to incorporate it into the soil for faster decomposition. The exception to this is winter rye, which does need to be tilled in because of its extensive root system. As a mulch, cover crops can continue to suppress weeds and add nutrients to the soil as they decompose. If you do choose to incorporate the plant residue into the soil, you do need to plan ahead 3 or 4 weeks, because as the decomposition occurs, it will tie up the nutrients that would be necessary for the next cropping season. So composting is the most common way that gardeners will add organic matter into their soil. It is biodegraded organic matter, and it's one of the best and least expensive soil amendments available. Composting has many of the same benefits of cover cropping. Compost can supply the nutrients plants need, at least some of them, and thus reduce the need for inorganic fertilizers. Composting can promote earthworms and other microorganisms, improving overall soil health, and improves the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the soil, increases the overall organic matter within the soil, improves water infiltration and drainage, and reduces landfill waste and our carbon footprint. So if you're going to get started with a compost pile, the first thing we need to consider is location. So we need to choose a location that receives at least 4 to 6 hours of sunlight every day. You want a nice level location with easy access to the garden and to the kitchen. You need access to water so you can maintain the right moisture level in your compost pile, and preferably a site with low visibility. So there are different ways to create your compost pile. So what we see here is referred to as a simple pile, sometimes called a compost heap. And you can see why some people might view this as messy and why we might want to choose a location with limited visibility. So here we see an example of multiple open piles. So this was taken at the Franklin Park Conservatory down in Columbus. We can see to the far left a pile that's in the process of decomposition, and the middle one that is further broken down, and to the right one that is fully broken down and ready to be used. We can also see that this has been walled off to limit visibility. So here we see 3 examples of closed single bins, 2 of them using wire fencing and 1 of them using snow fencing. So the advantage of this system is, of course, it gives you good airflow through the pile, but also does give you some control and allows it to remain more contained. So here we see some open bins. These are more permanent structures, whether they're constructed out of pallets or wood or cinder blocks, and these also can take the form of being either single bins as seen on the right, or they can be multiple bins as seen on the left. So here we see the supplies that would be needed to build an open bin from pallets. If you're doing a single bin, you'll need 4 pallets. If you're doing a 3-bin system, then you will need 10 pallets. You're going to need some power tools, some deck screws, some brackets, hinges, and chicken wire. The most important thing is to actually look at the pallets. You want to make sure that they say that they are KD, which stands for kiln dried, or HT, which stands for heat treated. What you want to avoid are pallets that are marked with MB, because that stands for methyl bromide, and methyl bromide is toxic. And you wouldn't want to be incorporating that into your compost, which would end up in your vegetable garden. One of the nice things about using pallets is that they're just about the right size. So we certainly want our compost piles to be about 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot. So the pallets actually provide a perfect environment for that. So there are closed multiple bins that are available commercially for sale. These are made out of the same material that we see decks and fencing being made out of, so they're a very rugged material. One thing to consider when looking at multiple closed bins is going to be your access to the material within the bin. Are you going to be able to access and turn it as needed? And what is the airflow through the bin, since airflow is critical for good decomposition? So there are stationary composting drums. These are typically relatively small and won't hold a large amount of material. They're often made out of durable black plastic, and it's important that they're black to help hold the heat that's necessary for decomposition. There are commercial compost tumblers on the market. These will hold more than the static bins. And aeration for these is as simple as turning the handle, which is why they have had increased popularity. Let's meet the recycling team. First, we have the physical decomposers. These are the organisms that break the plant debris into smaller pieces, and includes things like sow bugs, ants, slugs, springtails, and earthworms. And then we have the chemical decomposers. They're the ones responsible for changing the chemistry and excreting the plant nutrients. These include things like bacteria, actinomycetes, fungi, and molds. They use the organic matter as a food source, and require oxygen to complete the decomposition process. When building a compost pile, you're going to want to start with very coarse materials at the bottom, either branches or corn stalks. This is going to allow for good aeration and drainage. You're going to be adding alternating layers of high nitrogen material, about 25%, and high carbon material, about 75%. As you're building these layers, think of it sort of like building a layer cake. Periodically, you're going to want to add a small layer of soil or finished compost. If you've ever made sourdough bread and you've used a starter, it's the same idea. You are inoculating the pile with the organisms necessary for decomposition. When building a compost pile, we want to chop or shred large materials to increase their surface area. Ideally, a compost pile should be 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot tall in order to maintain enough heat for decomposition. It's important to maintain the correct moisture content as well, somewhere between 40 and 60%. This should feel like a wrung out sponge. It's important to turn the pile on a regular basis to provide the oxygen necessary for decomposition. In this figure, we see the relationship between compost pile volume, temperature, and days to decomposition. The larger the compost pile, the faster it heats up, the higher the temperature that is achieved, and the quicker the rate of decomposition. So what materials do we want to add to our compost pile? We want to add green leaves and grass clippings, vegetable scraps from the kitchen, weeds before they set seed. We can take eggshells, coffee grounds, and livestock manures like poultry or rabbit. Those are all good sources of nitrogen. Good sources of carbon, which are considered to be brown, corn stalks, straw, dry fall leaves, wood chips, sawdust provided that it does not have any chemicals in it, paper products, and dryer lint as long as it doesn't have anything synthetic in it. Here are some average carbon to nitrogen ratios in organic materials we typically find in compost piles. You're going to see some variability, particularly when we look at vegetables, grass clippings, and weeds, and that has to do with the water content found in those materials, and the same thing is true with fall leaves. This figure shows the effect of the carbon to nitrogen ratio on decomposition. At a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, we see that decomposition is optimized and occurs quickly. At greater levels of carbon, we see that decomposition occurs more slowly and takes an extended period of time. When looking at the materials we're placing in our compost pile, we should then try to always optimize to a 30-to-1 ratio. Here we see the impact of particle size on composting. 1-inch diameter pieces decompose at a much faster rate than 2- or 6-inch diameter pieces. This is an important consideration when including such things as corn stalks or woody stems in your compost pile. By grinding or shredding these into smaller pieces, we increase the surface area, which makes them more susceptible to bacterial invasion. Grinding is also an important consideration when thinking about fall leaves, since ground leaves are far less likely to compact together. By shredding and creating smaller particles, the compost pile is able to heat up more evenly and withstand excessive drying from the surface. Compost pile is also insulated against heat loss and is better able to resist moisture penetration from the rain. This figure illustrates the impact of aeration on the rate of decomposition. Greater aeration during the initial stages of decomposition increases the activity of the microorganisms and shortens the time needed for composting. It is important to know what to exclude from your compost pile. This includes the waste from household pets because they are a health hazard, meat, fish, and dairy products along with oils because these will attract unwanted wildlife, plywood and treated lumber, plastics, styrofoams, and synthetic fibers, and the leaves and branches from diseased plants. So composting problems can arise. So if your compost pile has a rotten odor, it very likely is that it has either too much moisture or is overly compacted. These issues can be resolved by aerating the pile and protecting it if we know that we're going to be inundated with either rain or snow. If your compost pile has an ammonia odor, that generally is an indication that you have too much green material and that the nitrogen is going off in the form of ammonia. To solve this problem, you want to add more brown material, which is high in carbon. If you find that your compost pile has an abundance of pests, many flies buzzing around it, they're likely being attracted to either meat or fatty foods. So you want to make sure to exclude these materials from your compost pile in the future. And for that overabundance of fly larvae, one of the things you want to do is to frequently turn that pile over and raise the temperature. If you find that wildlife is making a mess out of the pile, again, they're likely being attracted to meats and fatty foods, so just make sure to exclude those. You may find that the center of the pile is dry, which means that there's not enough water. This is a very easy problem to correct. You can slowly add water to the pile as you turn it. Remember that the compost pile should have about a 40% moisture content and should feel like a wrung out sponge. You might find that your compost is damp and only warm in the middle. So there are several potential causes for this problem. The pile itself might be too small, in which case you need to add more materials and mix them into the pile. It may be that you do not have enough green material in the pile in relation to brown, and so you need to add more of those grass clippings, young weeds, kitchen scraps, or a bit of nitrogen fertilizer. Or the composting may be complete, in which case the compost is ready to use. Here we see the 3 stages of composting. So to the left, we see the active pile that's being built with layers of green and brown. In the middle, we see the mature compost that's undergoing decomposition. And to the right, we see compost that is ready to use. So how do we know when compost is finished? It should have an earthy smell, should have a crumbly texture, it's generally dark in color, has no recognizable materials in it, and doesn't heat up when it's turned. How long does this process take? Composting can take as little as 8 weeks to up to a year, depending on the methods used, the ingredients, and the particle size and the size of the pile. So how do we use compost? Compost is like black gold. It can be mixed into the garden in the spring or the fall, can be used as mulch around ornamentals, and can actually be used to create your very own potting soil. Thank you for your time and your attention today. If you have questions after the program is over, I can be reached either by email at chanon.1@osu.edu or by phone at 440-326-5851. And with that, I will take questions and thank you.